Joining me now is Andrew Field, MBE, retired colonel and author of Quatre Bras, Prelude to Waterloo. Andrew, welcome to Waterloo Live. Let's start with the Allied position at the start of the battle. How precarious was it for the Allies in the early hours of the 16th of June?
Well, I think the first thing to talk about is that the troops that were actually on the position, certainly by late in the morning, were exclusively Netherlands troops, and they were the 2nd Netherlands Division of Perponche. And of course, there was that whole background to it about whether they should be moving troops to Quatre Bras, or if they'd have followed their orders of the night before, they would actually have concentrated all their troops at Nivelles. So the fact that there was a whole division at Quatre Bras was really, I guess, from Wellington's perspective, quite a bit of luck, because he certainly hadn't ordered them there. So what we're looking at, a strong division with about 7,500 troops, I think, and a couple of batteries as well, a horse battery and a foot battery. And of course, Prince of Orange had joined his troops there. Perponche's division was a part of his corps. He had joined them there in the early morning, and he had supervised their initial deployment. So by the time the French, commanded by Marshal Ney, were in a position to attack the Prince of Orange, he was pretty established in the position. Wellington had visited, had a look over the position, moved forward with the Prince and looked down on the approach that the French would make towards Quatre Bras, and actually convinced himself that the French were unlikely to attack there. Wellington believed that probably the whole of the French army under Napoleon was facing the Prussians down at Ligny, and therefore he left the Prince, not having interfered with his deployment, and gone off to visit Blucher over at Ligny to coordinate what he could do with his army as it came up to support the Prussians against Napoleon and hopefully defeat Napoleon early in the campaign. So Wellington shot off to visit Blucher, leaving the Prince of Orange behind. Marshal Ney, very much criticised for being slow on bringing his troops up. But it must be remembered he hadn't long been with the army. Up until that point, really the left wing had been under General A, who commanded the 2nd Corps. He had led the advance on the French left. But as the French had advanced, they'd left troops of D'Erlon's corps, which was following on the 1st Corps, along the route to protect the left flank of the advance and to occupy and observe over in that direction. So by the time we get to facing Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney only really commanded a fraction of his troops. A couple of divisions of his 2nd Corps, hit the cavalry division of that corps, and about 5 batteries. So about 9,000 infantry, so not that huge a superiority over the Prince of Wales. So by the time the battle started about 2 o'clock, the forces weren't as uneven as many people believe.
And let's stay with something that you raised there in terms of plans on both sides. What are the initial hopes and plans for both sides at the start of the day?
Well, I think from the Prince of Orange's point of view, he was concentrated around the crossroads, but at that point, he probably didn't really understand the significance of it compared to where the Prussians were. Of course, the road that ran from Quatre Bras ran down to the rear of the Prussian position, and so of course the Prussians were hoping that Wellington's army would march down that road and support them against Napoleon. For Marshal Ney, he had really been waiting during the morning for his orders, and eventually he received his orders, which were to occupy Quatre Bras. But at that point, they didn't really know that it was occupied by a substantial Allied force, and therefore Ney set off, I think, pretty much believing he was just going to march forward and occupy it. And of course, as the morning ran on, so Napoleon, seeing that the Prussians were holding, started sending orders across to Ney to march down the road from Quatre Bras in order to take the Prussians in the rear. So if you like, that road was really significant for both sides. But it was only later, after the battle really started, that people really understood the significance of it. So significant for Napoleon, wanting Ney to march down onto the rear of the Prussians, significant to Wellington, because if you like, having seen Blucher, he was planning to perhaps send some of his troops down there to support the Prussians, or directly south in order to come up on the flank and rear of Napoleon.
We've talked about sort of how precarious the situation was or wasn't, but it's very striking that the French make really good progress in the early part of the battle. Talk us through that, and how are the Allies able to sort of halt that progress and begin turning the tide of the battle?
Well, the key thing, of course, for the Prince of Orange and for Wellington when he returned to the battlefield was how quickly the rest of the army, which was now increasingly sent down to Quatre Bras rather than Nivelles, which was the original concentration area, was going to come down and reinforce the Prince of Orange's position. But until the first Allied troops arrived as reinforcements, the Prince of Wales had to fight the battle with what he had, those 7,500 infantry, no cavalry at all, against a whole French cavalry division, and only 2 batteries against a very powerful French artillery. So from the Prince of Orange's perspective, his was almost a delaying battle. He needed to hold on for as long as possible to give time for the Allied reinforcements to move down either from Nivelles or down from the Brussels road to reinforce his position and therefore throw Ney back. From Ney's perspective, he was increasingly aware that Napoleon was wanting him to have troops available to march down the road to Ligny and take the Prussians in the rear. And so he was very much focused then on seizing Quatre Bras, and didn't seem to consider that maybe he could send troops off to the flank without having to capture Quatre Bras itself, i.e. they could take some of the side roads across in that direction. But I think it's fair to say Ney was very focused on the crossroads, and perhaps really didn't think and really didn't know or understand that bigger picture of what Napoleon was expecting from him. So he was pushing his troops forward to try and overwhelm the Netherlands troops. And the way that the Prince of Orange had deployed his troops, of course, he couldn't be strong everywhere, and he sort of tried to adopt a sort of Wellington-esque deployment of hiding as many of his troops. So he put a fair proportion of his troops hidden into the Boissou Wood on the Allied right. He had over 3, nearly 4 battalions hidden away there. Across the open ground between the Brussels road and the road that ran down to Ligny, there were only 2 battalions, and then some battalions back at Quatre Bras in reserve. But of course, what he didn't seem to figure is that from a French perspective, they would want to maneuver their columns across the open ground and not get sucked into a battle for the Boissou Wood. So, if you like, his ideas were good, but he hadn't necessarily thought it through. So the 2 French infantry divisions that were available to Ney marched across the open ground, which was very thinly defended by a couple of infantry battalions. And although he quickly sent more battalions forward, they were really overwhelmed by the French advance, threatened by cavalry to which they had no real defense. And also their artillery was getting a real hammering from the very powerful French artillery. So right from the start, he was under real pressure, and the French were able to advance across the open ground and really start getting threateningly close to Quatre Bras itself. And then when Ney was reinforced by another one of Ney's division, then he could move some troops over to the Boissou Wood and start to clear that by pushing the Netherlands troops back there. But I think it's fair to say, if Van Merlen's Netherlands cavalry brigade hadn't turned up, there's a fair chance that within another half hour or so, the French and Marshal Ney would have actually seized the crossroads. But luckily for the Prince, Van Merlen's cavalry brigade turned up, 2 light cavalry regiments, and they were thrown into the fray. And although they were defeated and pushed back, if you like, the sacrifice of that brigade really saved the time, or gave at the time for the Allied reinforcements to turn up just in the nick of time.
There's a lot of controversy around the action of d'Erlon's corps during the battle. You've talked already about, troops being summoned from Ney's area of operations over to Ligny. For d'Erlon, he's meant to be at Quatre Bras, then Napoleon summons him across to Ligny, then Ney calls him back. What's your assessment of who's at fault for that debacle and the impact that it has on the course of the battle?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. And I think part of it lies the dichotomy we always face. We read previous histories which lays the blame here, there, or the other. But when you look at the primary sources, the accounts of the people that were involved, suddenly there are plenty of contradictions. No one seems to really be sure who delivered the message to d'Erlon's corps to forget Quatre Bras and cut to the right, to the east, over towards Ligny to support Napoleon. Two people are named. There's a possible third, and some of those have written accounts and some of them haven't. So if you look at d'Erlon's account, his account says he had moved forward towards the battlefield of Quatre Bras to see what the situation was there and wait for his corps to come up, and that whichever courier delivered the order delivered it to his corps following, and he was not with it. And it was only later, was he told, that his corps had already started its march over towards Ligny. So there are these real contradictions that make it difficult to apportion blame. I personally think that even when d'Erlon got the message and rushed to join his corps, if that's what actually happened, at the end of the day, the order for that had come from Napoleon, the emperor, the commander-in-chief. And really, it absolutely was his job to march in that direction and carry out the emperor's orders. So in that respect, it's difficult to blame d'Erlon for marching in that direction. However, of course,
no, please carry on.
But of course, what happened was that as he approached the battlefield of Ligny, because he hadn't marched down the road from Quatre Bras, which is what the French were expecting, the French left, commanded by Vandamme, saw this force marching across the fields towards them from a different angle to what was expected, and they were concerned that it was Wellington. And therefore, the final, perhaps the decisive attack that Napoleon was planning had to be stopped until they knew who these people were. And it was sometime later that the people came back to say it was d'Erlon's corps. And only then, if you like, Napoleon could carry on with his attack. He'd lost that time and daylight, if you like, that might have meant a decisive result. And then, of course, it was only just as d'Erlon approached the battlefield did he get the message from Marshal Ney demanding that he march back to Quatre Bras. And of course, Marshal Ney was d'Erlon's immediate commander. And he didn't really understand what the situation was then in Quatre Bras. So he faced this problem. What do I do? Do I carry on my march and make an impact at Ligny, or, as my immediate commander is demanding, I should march back to Quatre Bras? Perhaps Marshal Ney was in real trouble, and without this corps, he could have faced a significant defeat. And so d'Erlon made the decision to leave Duretz, one of his 4 infantry divisions, at Ligny, and then march back to Quatre Bras with his other infantry divisions and his cavalry division. Sadly, his orders to Duret were to act cautiously, the opposite of what Napoleon wanted, which was to significant formation to fall on the flank of the Prussians. And of course, they were insufficient really in strength to make a significant difference. And d'Erlon then marched back to Marshal Ney. So where might the problem lay? Perhaps partly with Napoleon, or not necessarily Napoleon, perhaps with Marshal Soult, in the order that he sent, didn't make the situation clear enough to either d'Erlon, or when it then went on and was delivered to Marshal Ney, so Ney knew what was going on, that Marshal Ney didn't ever really understand the significance of Napoleon fighting the Prussians at Ligny. And it was only late in the day, quite late in the day, that Napoleon realized that the whole of the Prussian army was in front of him. So I could understand why Ney might have made that, because he was focused on capturing Quatre Bras. More and more Allied reinforcements were arriving, and he wasn't strong enough then to seize it. So those were his troops, and he demanded them back. So partly D'Erlon, partly Ney, and partly probably Napoleon's headquarters, more likely sought in the way that he framed the order, rather than the direction that Napoleon gave him.
It's the epitome of communication problems, isn't it? Colonel Andrew Field, MBE, author of Quatre Bras, Prelude to Waterloo. Thank you for joining us on Waterloo Live.
Pleasure. Thank you.